Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the fifth community conversation. My name is Catherine Walsh, and I'm the Director of Veterans SA. Now, despite the need to stay at home for public health reasons, Veterans SA is still delighted to be able to bring you today's community conversation through this live stream, which ensures and enables maximum accessibility for everyone, no matter where you might be right now. Now, this webinar is being live streamed and recorded, and it will also be available on the Veterans SA YouTube channel later this week. Now, just to recap on the purpose of these community conversations, this is the fifth one, and it's a 2021 initiative that's led by Veterans SA in response to feedback from the South Australian veteran community, which identified a real thirst for more information about matters of importance to our community. We want to make sure our content is on point. So if you have any views around our back catalogue that's on our YouTube channel or suggestions around what we could have as conversation topics going forward, then please email us at veteransa@sa.gov.au. Now, today's topic is sovereign space capability in Australia. And this is in response to some parts of the community wanting to know what's really happening in terms of this new capability for Australia and the state and where the opportunities are in the future. So joining me today are two leaders from the South Australian State Government. I'd like to introduce you to, first of all, Reg Carruthers, who is the Executive Director of Defence and Space at Defence SA. And I'd also like to introduce you to Darren Lovett, who is the Director of Space at the South Australian Space Industry Centre. So on your behalf, I'd like to warmly welcome you gentlemen to our panel today.
Thanks, Catherine. It's wonderful to be part of it and really looking forward to a bit of a discussion around this exciting topic of space.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Happy to be here as well.
Fantastic. And I can see that you're both rugged up at and home this afternoon. So I would like to acknowledge that even though we're coming to you from across Adelaide, from our lounge rooms or our studies, that I want to acknowledge that we meet on the traditional land of the Kaurna people. And on your behalf and ours, I'd like to pay our respects to the traditional custodians and Kaurna elders past, present and emerging. I acknowledge their connection to the sea, land and sky, and I share their deep respect for our environment and our country. So without further ado, we've introduced our two panel members today. We know what we're talking about, so let's launch straight in. Like what I did there? So maybe, Darren, you could start us off and set the scene. So space is a really big place, and it might seem like an odd place to start, but can you explain about what you mean when you talk about space and what is sovereign capability as it relates to space and why that is important?
Yeah,
so
thanks,
3 questions
Catherine.
in one.
That is a big 3 questions. Space is really big, to quote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but it is important to put it into perspective. So if I can sort of break space up into what we're looking at, especially when we talk about new space, and then I'll answer that last question about sovereign capability. But have a think. The Himalayas are about 8 kilometers high. The Marianas Trench, which is the deepest point on the Earth we have known, is 11 kilometers deep. And so when we talk about space, we talk about really 2 zones. One zone is a classic where we run out of air and enough altitude, enough molecules to keep things flying. So we typically call that at about 100 kilometers. And then we go much further out to several 100,000 kilometers, which is sort of deep space. Just interestingly, Jeff Bezos, when he went up recently, got up to 106 kilometers. So he's considered to have reached space. And Richard Branson, just some time before, only hit 50 miles or 80 kilometers. But according to NASA and the US Air Force, that's where they also consider space. Doesn't really matter. It's high enough that you're running out of air and you've got to get into orbit to stay up there. If we talk about the orbits, there really are sort of 4. There's a Molniya orbit, which goes out hundreds of thousands of kilometers, and it comes rushing back to the Earth very close on the downside. But really the 3 orbits that we're most interested in is geostationary orbit, and that's a point on the Earth out at 36,000 kilometers out from the equator. It's a sort of a strange point where if you're at that altitude, your position around the Earth matches the Earth's rotation. And the important thing about that is that's where a lot of our large communication satellites are. We have a medium Earth orbit somewhere in between 100 and 36,000 kilometers. That's where a lot of our GPS satellites are, at about 20,000 kilometers. And then right in close, at only 300 to 500 kilometers typically, is low Earth orbit. And that's really where a lot of the new space capability options are emerging, because it's much closer. You can use miniaturized electronics, but you're moving much faster over the Earth. And finally, sovereign capability. It's a really difficult question because it hasn't really been defined by the Australian government yet in terms of what it means for space. But to my mind, sovereign means that we are dealing in a world where threats are emerging. We have important capabilities like weather and communications that we need to rely on. And so to my mind, sovereign is the ability to actually access and use those capabilities, and potentially to add resilience to those capabilities by providing the ability to fill in holes or to launch our own assets. So it's a long answer to a big question.
Well, it's also, there's not only is it a long answer, but it's a really dense one as well. So if I can just unpack that a little bit, you sort of talked about space and then deep space, and then you sort of broke that up into sort of, I guess I'm a visual person, 3 rings around the Earth. And you were talking about that most of the concentration is going to be in that 300 to 500 kilometers, that low orbit space. Did I hear that correctly?
A lot of the emerging capabilities are in that low Earth orbit. Yeah, it can go up to 1,000 kilometers, but we're talking about for SpaceX, they're talking about thousands of satellites in that 800 kilometer range, compared to a couple of hundred in geostationary orbit. So those big old satellites we still rely on are very heavy and require a lot of lift to get them up out there, and you need companies like Boeing and Lockheed and Ariane to get them up. But for this low Earth orbit, we can do with much smaller rockets, much more innovative companies, and you can actually do things a lot closer to home.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Darren. And I recall a conversation we had a few weeks ago, you just talking about the further out to space, then, the more oomph you need and the bigger the satellites. Can you just help our audience understand what size that looks like to be able to launch, say, a deeper space satellite as opposed to one in the lower orbit? Just so we can conceptualize this, because it's all pretty overwhelmingly huge.
Yeah. That's another good question. The big thing about getting into space is actually getting to orbital velocity. So it's not so much a question of altitude, it's more about speed. You have to get up to about 26,000 kilometers an hour, Mach 7 in military terms, to get up into orbit. Now, the difficulty is it takes you a lot of energy to get up out of the gravity well and up to that speed. Once you're up there in low Earth orbit at the 500 kilometer marks, it's going to take you a lot more energy again to get up to GEO. So to get up to GEO and lift, say, 20 tons, which is the big, heavy national reconnaissance payloads and also our weather satellites and comm satellites, you need a rocket that is currently the largest in the world, like things like Delta IV or the Chinese rockets, Long March series. They are 100 meters tall, and they have a lot of millions of kilograms of fuel on board. They can burn 4 tons of fuel a second. But if we come closer to the Earth with those smaller rockets, we're now talking about rockets that are only, say, 20 meters tall and have about 1/100th the mass. So it becomes exponentially easier the closer you stay to the Earth, because in order to get up faster and higher, you need to carry more fuel to carry the fuel to burn the fuel. So it actually becomes a very difficult problem the further you want to go out.
No, thanks for that. For somebody who's not a space expert, that was really super helpful to give me a sense of both dimensions in terms of size as well as weight. And I also realized that just before I ask my next question, that all of our audience who are watching live stream today, there is an ability within your Zoom to be able to type out some questions. So as we're going, if you have any questions for Reg or for Darren, then please put them in the chat box and they'll be conveyed through to us, and we can incorporate those throughout the conversation. There'll also be a chance at the end for a Q&A as that goes. So we look forward to hearing from you as we continue our odyssey through what is space and sovereign capability. So thanks for that, Darren. So Reg, if I can maybe turn to you, as we've heard from Darren just then, and he really set the scene beautifully, there's a great deal of opportunity for Australia, and I'm guessing, particularly in that low orbit space, that there's a lot of emerging players. Can you touch on the ones that are around now and what their niche is? Because I imagine it's not just government, but also commercial entities are competing for a slice of space.
Yeah, Catherine, it's a great question and a really good segue into where Australia is heading with space. I think, look, it's important to start with what actually defines space. I mean, obviously, the bit that as soon as you say space, everybody thinks astronauts, rockets, satellites, and all of that things that we've seen in movies going way back. And South Australia and Australia has a great history in space, going back to the Woomera days and RESAT, and we're the third or the fourth nation in the world to build and launch our own satellite from Woomera in 1967. But it is really so much more than that, and we really took a bit of a break from developing space in this country and really became a repository based on geographic convenience. So we've got a lot of ground-based data centers, we've got receiving stations, we've got large satellite dishes, but in reality, we took a bit of a break from actually developing our own space sector and space industry, and that's why it's such an exciting time right now. And so some of those key players, I suppose, both at the federal and the state government level, and we'll talk a little bit about commercial in a minute. But obviously it starts at the top with the Australian Space Agency, now headquartered here in Adelaide. And that really was a flow on from the International Astronautics Congress back in 2017, which Adelaide successfully bid for. And that really was fundamental in where we're now going in space. So the Australian Space Agency headquarters is down in Lot 14, that under the Department of Industry federally. But that is absolutely key in driving forward the vision and the strategy for the space sector in Australia. Underneath that, or in South Australia, the key organisation really is the South Australian Space Industry Centre, which is a state government entity. Both Darren and I are directors on that. And that's been responsible, and Darren, quite frankly, has been responsible for writing the South Australian space sector strategy, which really clearly outlines what we as a state want to do as part of a national endeavour to drive forward the space sector and the space industry in particular. There are other entities. There's the Smart Satellite Cooperative Research Centre, also headquartered down in Lot 14, is the biggest funded research, and they're required to get a whole bunch of stuff on orbit during their 7-year life. But that's about a $250 million enterprise if you take cash in kind. It's got almost 100 participants in that, from universities to industry. Defence has announced it's setting up its own space division, and that, I think we'll see some announcements on that towards the end of the year as they define what that's going to look like from the defence sector. Space Industry Association is a strong advocate for both the industrial development, but the space strategy and policies separately. And then, of course, you've got CSIRO, you've got geospatial organisations. But that's really, I suppose, traditionally, going back to Darren's point about old space, it really was the purview of a few governments around the world. And in Australia, we weren't developing our own capabilities. We were very much buying either space on other people's satellites, data streams, right through from telcos to media, and defence, and those big agencies in Canberra have been the biggest purchasers and still have the biggest budgets for space. And that tends to be the case around the world, with a couple of notable exceptions. So to your point about, so that's the defence sector and those traditional uses of military communications and observation data and intelligence. The Australian space sector, or the new space sector, is very much focused at the moment on developing those commercial applications. And that has given birth to a whole bunch of totally different companies and industry sectors and sort of, as you said, I think the niche capabilities. And we've got a couple of very notable and successful ones in South Australia, and there are companies spread right around the country. So companies like Fleet Space, Myriota, Innovor, who are already building, launching their own satellites and selling commercial product into the space sector. And our job really is to grow those embryonic to some degree capabilities into a burgeoning space sector, so that we can do that end to end from launch to satellite building to then provision of data and then analysing and using that data as intelligence. So as product, as data in its own right. We're swamped with data. I think one of the key points to make is that most people in the street don't realise how reliant they totally are on space on a day-to-day basis. It's not that satellite rocket building, but everything from your mobile phone to Netflix that you're watching to timing signals for pretty much every device you use in your house and the Internet of Things has got some link to space. So it's that definitional piece, and then it rolls into associated sectors like agriculture, where farmers are using space-based data to not only position their tractors, but also to monitor how much fertilizer to put on a particular part of their paddocks. The mining industry is going to completely remote use vehicles. So the protection of all of the data and intellectual property and all of the data that is collected is a huge growth area for things like for cybersecurity. And then right down to solving the world's big problems like climate change or the quality of the Murray River and algal blooms. The only way we're going to be able to actually solve those is using actual data as opposed to emotion. The only way to reliably get that data in a timely fashion and monitor it on a continual basis is from space. So there are huge opportunities, both in terms of what we can achieve with space, but also that then rolls into the industrial base, into the small startups growing into bigger companies, really building that space ecosystem around the country. But obviously our focus is here in South Australia. And that's what presents those huge opportunities for not only the kids that are coming out of school and going through university now, but obviously with the audience today, it's those people that come out of defence or our veteran community, which really comes with a whole bunch of skill sets already that can really contribute to where we need to go with the space sector.
Wow. All right. So I'm going to unpack that a little bit. Thank you, Reg. There's certainly a lot there. So if I just sort of summarize what I heard in terms of the original question around the players, so there's obviously a number of federal government agencies, and I heard you talk about CSIRO. Obviously, Department of Defence will be a significant contributor to that, and the Australian Space Agency, which is located here in South Australia. But then, of course, we also have a number of contributing state government entities that feed into that as well. So as you pointed out, the South Australian Space Industry Centre, the SASIC, obviously there would be links into regional South Australia, potentially through, say, PIRSA, through infrastructure and transport, through DIT. And then, of course, there's the commercial piece. And I found that really interesting when you were talking about the emerging opportunities and some of the sectors which can really benefit from that data collection and data management that comes from space. But I guess the flip side to that is with more data, then also there are challenges around what to do with that data and who owns that data and how do we protect that data as well. So the fact you touched on intellectual property is a really interesting one, because I guess there's also opportunity for employment or career opportunities outside of just being rocket cone engineers. I mean, I automatically hear space law is a really developing industry, and what does that look like from a commercial setting as well as from a national security setting as well? So, would that be a fair synopsis of the content you just gave?
Look, it absolutely is. I think, look, the key point is that it is so cross-sector. And you mentioned space law, and Melissa de Zwart down in Adelaide University is one of the preeminent experts in the world in terms of the ethical use of space and the militarisation of space, and working on the Woomera manual with Canada and the UK. But your points about the cross-government departments and PIRSA, and it's down to not only drones, but space monitoring of moisture levels in the vineyards. So, our next bottle of red wine, the quality is hopefully better as time goes on because of that sort of actual monitoring of the data. But the one of the smart satellite CRC projects is actually the monitoring of the Murray. And as I said, there's lots of emotive talk about how much water we can take off for cotton crops, but there really is a frightening lack of data, of ongoing data, in terms of not only monitoring who's taking the water, but also the flows. And then we sort of wait for a condition to get to a point where we go, oh, look, there's an algal bloom at this particular point on the river. But we actually want to have a long-term solution to the proper management of the Murray-Darling Basin, which is absolutely fundamental to the success of Australia as a nation. Then we do need to be collecting real-world data. And then, as you correctly say, is then what do we do with that? Because data in its own right is just ones and zeros in a stored somewhere, either in the cloud or in a large room. So what we're starting to try and make both government departments but also industry aware of is what use can you get from small satellites and small packets of data using sort of Internet of Things type terminology. So one of the examples I use is South Australian Power Networks, or going back to the farmers, monitoring of their water stocks for their stock is at the moment jump on a motorcycle and drive out to their regular route to go around all of their water points and just check what the water levels are like inside their tanks. If you put a very small and quite inexpensive sensor on there that just says, and you just say, I just want you to tell me when my tank gets down to a third full, you don't need to go and check that on a motorbike. You can literally have that data sent in a small package. It sits there and doesn't do anything until it gets down to a third full, sends a very small packet of data to a small satellite zinging around overhead. That then downloads that data to Farmer Brown's, an application on Farmer Brown's phone, which just says you probably need to go and either move the sheep or check on whatever tank number it is where the water's dropped to a third full. So the sort of productivity gains that can be utilised right now are phenomenal. And that then triggers, well, what if I could do this with my data from space? That opens up those opportunities across all of those sectors. So as I said, it's a really exciting time. A lot of it is about education of what is available and the art of the possible. And that's why having this cross sector, from legal to ethics to the arts to the creative arts sector, to everybody involved, is what is going to unleash the real potential of what we can actually do from space.
I love that phrase, what the art of the possible is. So thanks for that, Reg. And given space is hard and costly, and I heard you say at the top of your conversation that back in the late 60s, we were the fourth country to launch our own satellite out of Woomera. And then there was a bit of an operational pause, and now there's a resurgence of that. Perhaps, Darren, I could ask you, I guess the question to why we need to compete in the space market is evident from what Reg has just talked about. And I'm guessing that timing is critical, because if we don't do it now, then our ability to be able to control our destiny, control the data, imagine what's possible will pass us by. If we don't succeed, or if we aren't as forward-leaning as we have been as a country, as a state, in terms of developing this capability, what implications does that have for Australia across the rest of the century?
These are good questions, Catherine. You're pulling out of the conversation. Look, there is a market there. It is worth pursuing. So the projections are that the current markets are anywhere from $330 to $360 billion globally, and it's expected to expand anywhere up to $1 to $1.4 trillion by 2030. That represents double-digit growth. So you don't get that today in many markets. Space is growing phenomenally, 10% compounded annually, and is expected to do so for at least the next decade. So capturing some of that market's important. Australia globally gets about 2% of anything, 1% to 2% of anything in terms of agriculture or investments. And so currently our space capabilities are much lower than that. And so the expectation is that we should be at least be able to grab at least a market share for what Australia typically gets. But the problem is, we talked about this old space. It's very hard to break into a market that has been dominated by those companies that have been operated since the 60s, that have sort of classified and taken over space, and they put large capability up there. And they really have a lot of sunk cost and a lot of engineering effort involved. The opportunity for us is this new space market. It's characterized by private investment, whereas old space is typically government. It's enabled by miniaturization of electronics. So things like your iPhone now can produce a very good camera, which in the past would have been 10 times the size or 100 times the size, as we know, going back even just 20 years with the size of cameras. The complexity of engineering is becoming a lot easier to deal with, because if you're only putting up lots of small satellites that are cheap, then you can afford to have some of them fail. Whereas if you're putting up one $20 billion satellite or $1 billion satellite, you really need to make sure it works. So for Australia, the question is more about, do we want to capture some of this market? And it's not going to be easy, because we do have about 10 hubs around the world all trying to capture this new space market, and hundreds of companies. So it's not a guarantee. And the question is, for Australia, do we want to get there? We do really well selling rocks and crops. We're the 10th richest country in the world. A lot of veterans out there, can understand that Australia, having been overseas, really does well. We are a lucky country. But the real issue for us is the future in terms of getting off those crops. And we've already seen the influence of countries like China as they rise in power, cutting off some of our exports, but also just, making some of the issues about space security questionable. And so the issue for us really is resilience and sovereign capability. Do we need to have capability up there that provides our way of life for Australians? And I'd argue, yes, there is an opportunity to build capability in Australia, to launch it up into those low Earth orbits, and to actually provide capability for us that will either help with things like agriculture and aquaculture, as Reg mentioned, but also to add notions of deterrence and resilience, so that our space layers are less a threat if they can be replaced or filled in by other capabilities. Not sure if that hits all those points, but
it totally does. And in fact, you introduce a really great new one. So I think we started the conversation, and this might be reflective of our common military backgrounds, as we started thinking about this in terms of a national security piece. And then Reg talked about some of the opportunities in different sectors, but you've just introduced, of course, there's a real economic benefit and opportunity that if we are successful in managing or harnessing space-based activity, what that can look like. And I think that's a great segue to a question that we've received from one of our audience today. So thank you, Mark, for the question. So Mark wants to know, and I think this is an economic question then, for either of you, what's South Australia's competitive advantage, and what are the opportunities here out of all of this?
Do you want to start on that, Darren?
Sure, I can start. I mean, Reg has already covered it in terms of the space agency being here, the infrastructure. But our competitive advantages, I would argue, are that we have a lot of phenomenally proactive space supporters in South Australia, and they've been around for decades. And we've talked about WUMRA. Australia, arguably the fourth country in the world to launch its own satellite, but it was on a US Redstone rocket, and it took a consortium to occur. But we did have thousands of engineers coming over from overseas, from Belgium, from the UK, to work near Adelaide and up north of WUMRA. And I really think a lot of that legacy, which then became the Defence Science and Technology Group back from the old Weapons Research Establishment, a lot of that has permeated our local society. So it's very easy to find someone who knows of someone from WUMRA or has been working in that space industry. And I think that's really what has helped propel South Australia forward, created a critical mass. And what I think we see now is, as we look around the ecosystem, and it's not the only space ecosystem in Australia, but there's certainly a certain size you're starting to see people moving between companies, investment money coming in. We're getting calls from overseas all the time, from Europe, from Singapore, other nations looking to understand what's happening in South Australia and how they can partner up with us to do great things. So, there are all of these really hard to quantify elements that are coming together. But if we do look at the statistics, we have about $2 billion of pipeline investment over the next 10 years coming into Australia. South Australia is capturing a large percentage of that. And we have got those other critical infrastructure pieces that Reg has mentioned. So it's all looking pretty good.
I think, look, Catherine, I think the only thing I'd add to that was it's very hard to quantify what the value of that ecosystem is, except when they were looking at the location for the space agency, the case for South Australia was compelling because the team that was around looking at and of course every state wants to have the headquarters of the Australian Space Agency in. It's just such an important draw card, and if you Google headquarters Australian Space Agency, Adelaide pops up, and there's actually a tangible value in that. But when the reviews were going, and of course they went to all states, what was so noticeable here in Adelaide is that in the same room you had state government representatives from a whole bunch of departments. You had our startup space companies represented there. You had people just from, as we mentioned before, from Melissa Deswart at Adelaide University. We had our legal team. We had people from all three universities. We had researchers. And not only were they in the same room, but everybody knew each other. So it was very obvious that we had already, because this journey into space is not something that you just literally start. You've really got to have that belief, and there is a whole bunch of leadership required, and that belief and pushing the case, and that is evident in Adelaide, and that's how Adelaide tends to work across a bunch of sectors. But it really is an important part of us continuing to develop this important sector, and I know we'll talk a little bit later with a couple of other questions, but it was fed back to us that it was so noticeable that the Adelaide space ecosystem was already in existence, and therefore it almost became a no-brainer to put the headquarters here, and that's a very important point for us as a state and as a nation, I like to think.
Thank you both, gents. So I'm hearing that, and I loved your phrase, Darren, about space supporters. So I hear that there's an infrastructure piece, there's an academic and a research piece, there's a cultural piece. It's sort of in our state's DNA for over the last 50 years. And sort of when you mix all of those together, that makes it a really promising environment from which we can, continue to thrive. So I really, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I guess if I can follow on with that, so we sort of started with big picture and context, and now let's drag it down to a bit more around the state, which we've sort of talked about a bit. Reg, if we ask the so what question for South Australia and for our audience, we've been positioning ourselves, as we've been talking about, or as a centre of gravity for space. Maybe could you talk us through some of the specifics about what state government is doing? Like you touched on the space strategy and how that has to fit into a national context, for example. Could you maybe talk us through that a little bit more?
Look, I feel like a bit of an imposter, to be honest, talking about the strategy. Obviously, I worked with it, but Darren pulled that together, and it's an impressive piece of work. And I know we will put the links at the end of this talk so people can chase that around more. Look, one of the key aspects of the strategy, it's more than identifying what we currently do. It's what do we want to do as a state contributing to that national space endeavour. So what part do we want to play? We've got to accept, and it's fantastic that there are companies right around the country. Western Australia's got huge amounts of investment in the Square Kilometre Array and looking into deep space, and Gilmore Space up in Queensland is getting is a long way through development of its sort of Australian designed and hopefully launched rockets. So to your point, we need to build on our geographic strengths, but also our historical strengths. If you look around the world historically, space has only developed because of huge amounts of government investment. So, the US, for all of the SpaceX and how wonderful Elon is, there are still huge amounts of the dollars that are coming from the US taxpayers. Australia's gone down a different path. Surely, clearly there is some investment at the federal level, but it is nothing in terms of the quanta that you're getting into those sectors in many countries around the world. But we don't generally see that as a problem, other than there is clearly some areas where if we want to fast track and get to where we want to be a bit quicker, that it is going to take some targeted investment, but also just focusing in on those things that naturally are our strengths. So from a South Australian perspective, that we genuinely believe that we need to, and we're perfectly positioned to have a sovereign launch capability. And we're working as a department, we're working very closely with a company called Southern Launch, who are putting in their environmental impact statement and proposals for a launch facility down near Whalers Way, which is just out of Port Lincoln. They've already got an approved launch site out of Caniba, which is the Aboriginal community at Caniba, which they've already done their first successful launch from mid last year. But again, as a state government, all we do is we go through the process of supporting them whilst they put in their approvals, and it'll go to the minister, and the minister will decide yes or no whether that's a viable proposition for the state. Darren is already running a program. The state government committed a bunch of money last year or earlier this year, to build our own satellite, so SASAT-1. Now, yes, we will end up buying a satellite and building a satellite, and Darren's involved in that day to day. Really, that is about provision of a whole bunch of data services, and that is about educating, and going back to that point earlier about all government departments getting an understanding of the beauty of data from space and what they can use it for, and it's already generating a lot more interest from a whole bunch of departments that probably didn't even realise how much they actually needed that data. But it's not just those satellites, and obviously we'll support Fleet Space, and Fleet is an amazing company with their comms facilities. They're doing some really leading edge research on some of their multispectral comms. Myriota is a very successful already commercial seller of internet services, and they're using their own software-defined radios, and it really is all tech, and it's all happening down on North Terrace, which is kind of cool. But there's a whole bunch of other activities that we can do to build. So we need to be able to support. If we want this to be a sustainable industry, it's no good just building a satellite company up and growing that satellite company. We want them to be able to, to continue to inspire, but bring up the workforce. So we need to target people at schools, and I mean, there's nothing motivates like space. I've been working in the defence industry since I left the federal government. Very rarely do we get phone calls saying, I really want to be involved in the defence industry sector, but we get multiple phone calls a week saying, I want to be an astronaut, I want to be involved in space. So we actively support colleges like the Hamilton Secondary College down south of the city there. They've got a great program, the Mars Experience, where you're sort of 12-year-old students, 12 to 14-year-old, go and actually get involved in a mission to Mars. They put on their astronaut suits. They have real-world communications. It's all done in the environment down at school, and then they do some scientific research based on what they found wandering around on the pseudo-surface of the moon. They're building a planetarium down there, which it's ginormous, and it's going to be fantastic. Engaging with the education institutions to make sure that the courses that are available both at university, obviously we don't control university, but we can influence some of the courses, so that our next generation of scientists and people that are going to be involved in the space sector, as I said, go back to it's cyber. It's really pretty much anything you think of can be related to space. So it is a side benefit of the excitement that is generated around the space sector. So a kid that is going through school right now who is really interested in coding and doing data work probably doesn't think I'm going to be involved in the space sector. But if they go and start either working or studying at the Institute of Machine Learning and doing that artificial intelligence and advanced machine learning and building algorithms for how we process data, they're as involved in space as somebody who is actually building the satellite down on North Terrace. So there, and then we talked earlier about the legal aspects and the ethics of space, and when is it right to use it. We're starting through University of South Australia, we sponsor a startup program through the ICC, where Canadian company or startup Lux Astronautics has decided to make Adelaide their home because they want to do high altitude pseudo satellite work, which is currently being used or identified as a really useful asset in the monitoring of bushfires. So it's hard to sort of really boil it down into why is this important and what are we doing. State government has got to focus on those activities that will drive the rest of the sector, and then assume and hope that everything else comes along. And I'm supremely confident that we've got those settings just about right.
Well, thank you, Reg, and also right at the top of the conversation, acknowledging Darren's personal and professional contribution to the state space strategy. You touched on certainly pipeline and around how it's so easy to capture one's imagination and enthusiasm, particularly when you're in the school system around wanting to be an astronaut or a rocket cone engineer, et cetera, et cetera. But recognising that most of our listeners today on our audience are part of a mature workforce, maybe, Darren, I could ask you a double-barreled question. One is around where are there some key opportunities from a career and employment perspective across the next 10 years? Because, this is a long burn building of capability. As Reg said, you don't just flick a switch overnight. But also the second part to that question, so one's, I guess, about economic opportunity for individuals or for sectors that support space. But the second piece is we have another question from the audience, which is what can the community do to support capability development, which is slightly different from a purely employment perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. So the opportunities, look, in like all of these growing industries, especially defence, the classic opportunities are people who can build things, coordinate activities, and get money to make those things happen. So we're still looking for project engineers, project managers, not only engineers that can actually design rockets and create propellants and things, but the whole ecosystem. So people who can support around the outside in terms of either law or understanding the risk and insurance of certain new novel activities, moving propellants, for example. We've already got companies that are out there doing capabilities they hadn't thought about. So we have companies supporting fleet, for example, building 3D printed flat plate antennas, which are first in the world on small satellites, and they're being built right here in Adelaide. So it's difficult at this stage because the industry is small. We're not talking about like the mining sector or agriculture. We're still talking about thousands of people doing things and growing quickly. So those jobs will emerge in interesting places. Now, given that we have got a veterans community, I think one of the important things to understand when we look at space skills is it's those soft skills that are still required. So people who can coordinate activities, who can build teams, who can deliver on time, and who can assess risk and manage projects. So that's still a really important factor. In terms of how people can get involved in the future, we're still talking about different companies that will pop up. But I think Reg has gone through a lot of those different areas. I guess we might have to wait and see if any other questions come up about those. But to your last question, Catherine, you mentioned what is the message that we can take away from our community? And I think it's this. If we look at where Australia is, we are typically focused on our own national sovereignty as a matter of pride. And we have Talisman Sabre running right now, the world's largest war game scenario exercises I've been involved in as well. We've got hundreds of thousands of people out there on ships and over in Hawaii, and Australians operating in those exercises. And we have one Chinese intelligence ship floating off the coast, and it really sparked up a whole amount of interest in Australia. And yet things are happening in space all the time these days. We have jostling, closure activities, jamming, satellites that were dead that now have reawakened. And yet none of that inspires the interest or activates a response in the way we see it in the terrestrial domain. So I think the message for me is understand that space is critically important for our way of life here on Earth, and we can do something to ensure those notions of resilience and deterrence. And what we can do is, I think, help show defence that we have the capability here in Australia to actually make some of those capabilities, like satellites that can go up into space, but also the ecosystem around it, that we can do things that we sort of put aside for 50 years. We don't have to just rely on the US or Europe. Just like other capabilities, Australians are very clever, very progressive. We have fantastic intellectual property and patents that are developed every year in terms of technology. We just don't know how to commoditize that. And so if we look at where Australia has been, we're currently the world's second largest procurer of weaponry from the US, just second to Saudi Arabia. And for aerospace, we typically buy jets and things. But for space, I think we can actually add value back to the Five Eyes Alliance and work with, say, partners like our Commonwealth Five Eyes partners, like the UK and New Zealand, to actually increase that capability and send it back. And I think that's a message that has to be permeated through defence, because I don't think the few space specialists in defence understand what's happening in this fantastically fast ecosystem that we have here. Things are moving really quick. Capability is being created every day.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. And again, both yours and Reg's answers are really comprehensive, and you cover a lot of ground or a lot of space. But I particularly liked how right at the end you were reflecting around the fact that even though we are a smaller country, that we can certainly value add on a global scale and make a contribution and a real difference as well. And I think that flexibility and agility that you've described really comes to the fore. Thank you also for touching on some of the I guess professional opportunities that exist, and reminding us that it's not just the pointy end of those people who are actively involved in the science and the engineering and the coding and the technical piece of making sure that we can have a sovereign space capability, but there are necessarily all of those other essential functions that we find in every other sector that those opportunities exist in space as well. And I guess I'm hearing that in the South Australian context is you could be a project manager in agriculture or real estate or medicine, but those same skill sets are transferable into space to be able to help build that sovereign capability. So it's an entire spectrum of employment opportunities. And if we look at it through the value add that our former military service women and men can contribute, you touched on a number of the attributes and the skills and the qualifications that they come out into their post-military employment and what they can offer to the space sector as well. So thanks, Darren. I do have a slightly random topic, random question. Reg mentioned about how last year that there was a launch of a rocket in South Australia. Now, as we know, 2020 was had opportunities and a number of challenges as a result of COVID. How did COVID affect our emerging space capability in South Australia? Did it present opportunities? Did it impair and put us back a couple of years, or a bit of both? That's a question for either of you.
Well, look, I'll probably start on that one just to touch a little bit more on that particular launch. But can I just going back to the previous one really quickly on the opportunities for veterans? I'd make a really important point. I think it's important that a lot of our veterans are parents themselves. So part of how our veteran community can assist, and this is and it's not just in the space sector. Parents are so influential on the decisions that their children make. It's still the case. And I know children are becoming, the more wise, younger, and all of those sort of things. But I still see a very strong influence by parents, in particular fathers, on their daughters in terms of those decisions that they make as they're going through school. And I think understanding the opportunities that space presents, and space in a very broadest context, and that importance. And I'm kind of over the term STEM, but I think it's here to stay. But those are just so important in terms of the developing the just recognizing those opportunities for our kids coming through. The second point on the veterans piece is we really do highlight the strengths that our veteran community brings to the commercial world, and it's something which I really didn't understand greatly until obviously I moved into the state sector about 5 years ago. But we also need to acknowledge that there are a bunch of areas that, through the nature of our defence business, we're not particularly expert in. So it's, again, understanding where those deficiencies, terrible word, but where those gaps in our total sort of build as a person, and I recognise those in myself, in that I had very little understanding of how the commercial world actually operated. So that business sense, the business planning, because it is a critical part of moving into the commercial sector, is actually understanding what a business is trying to achieve and the constraints under which it needs to do that. So it's not something that we should be feel bad about. It is just through the nature of our military service, and I did 35 years in Air Force, that they are just not areas that we focus on. But we bring some incredibly strong skill sets, organisational, project management, a real pragmatic approach to getting things done, teamwork, leadership, all of those things which are absolutely critical out in the commercial world. But they are there are things that we can continue, whether we're still in the service or recently left from the service, is work out where those where those areas are that we could probably do a bit more work. And I've certainly, as I said, I've personally experienced that over the 5 years. So look, just going back to your question, Catherine, COVID has had some impact, but it has not been. I don't think it has been particularly detrimental. Certainly in the development that I've seen. Darren may have some on the specific space companies. A lot of the companies that are involved in the actual development, certainly of payloads in space, are also in the defence sector. Defence sector was very strong. Defence industry sector was very strongly supported during COVID. And in fact, a lot of our small to medium enterprise companies around South Australia have been as busy, if not busier, during COVID. Bills have been paid quicker. So it really didn't affect the actual development of the hardware necessarily. Going to the launch at Caniba, it was a small rocket, but there were those practical problems of getting components and rocket motors delivered into country. There were restrictions on how many people could go. You couldn't move people around the state. You might have had one component stuck on the dock in Sydney trying to get through quarantine. So there were those practical logistical sort of impacts. But overall, I don't think it has set back our sort of strategic goals. It was a fairly early stage in the development of the national space strategy, and the Space Agency has still managed to do a lot of work. I think again, Darren can make an assessment. I don't think we're much further behind where we'd anticipate being at this stage. I think the actual goal is, looking forward, is we would really like to accelerate our sort of 10-year goal and bring that as far left as we can, based on the realities, both commercially and also just the practicalities of competing in the space environment. But my gut feeling is that it hasn't had a huge impact COVID has not had a huge impact on where we should be as a spacefaring nation.
Great, thanks. Darren, do you have anything you wanted to add to Reg's answer?
I'll only add a little bit. I mean, Reg covered most of it, and I agree with what he said. The companies that we've got have been doing pretty well through COVID. Surprisingly, they've been growing. I think what we've seen, though, is on the new entrant side. If you're a young company, a startup, it has been a bit harder to get money if you're looking for venture capital or investments. But the companies that we've got that have been working have been growing. We talked about that launch from Caniba. That was done in the middle of COVID. We've got Myriota is putting up more satellites and is also developing new and novel sensors on the ground. Fleet has got its 6th satellite up recently. Innovor has announced that they want to build larger class of satellites, and they're also working with Myriota and the SmartSat CRC to build our state satellite, the SA-SAT-1, which will do a mission which will have a hyperspectral sensor and also Internet of Things. So there's still a lot going on. We're as busy as ever, and we're still seeing a lot of interest and energy, and we've just got to keep at the head of that wave and keep rolling with it.
Great. Thanks, gentlemen. Now, we've got about 7 minutes left until the end of our conversation today. So I do want to do a final call out to our audience. If you want to ask any further questions, then please type them in the chat box. We've already had a couple that we've incorporated in the conversation. So just to give you a little bit of time, I'm just going to ask one last quick question of Reg and Darren, and then we can come back to any final questions. So, gentlemen, we've talked a lot about opportunities, and a lot of that you reflected, Reg, that there's a significant footprint at Lot 14, so smack bang on North Terrace in the heart of Adelaide CBD. But necessarily some of the places that you've talked about are in regional South Australia, and if we think about the fact that there are communities there that need to support and be part of these launch activities and developing our sovereign space capability. Can you maybe reflect on what that support looks like and what community engagement has been to date, particularly over the last 12 to 18 months?
Yeah, look, let me pick a couple of examples that just come to mind. So we mentioned before about Southern Launch doing the proposal for their bigger launch facility down at Whalers Way, which is near Port Lincoln. They have been very proactive, and a new activity like a launch facility creates a lot of interest and a lot of concerns, and then that's the process that the company is going through, and we're going through that we've got a very structured development process that we need to go through. So both from a government perspective and also from a company perspective, they have been very active in the community, talking to everybody from councils to local landholders to industries that are involved, the fishing fleets down there, both tuna and abalone and pilchards, and it's really about, and I go back to that earlier point I made about understanding what space and what the space sector actually means. But the feedback from certainly the community and the opportunities that people see in that, from everything from tourism. I mean, anytime you're going to be launching a rocket, I guarantee there's going to be a bunch of people who are happy to go and park their utes up the road and watch it go. From the opportunities for that motivation or that inspiration for the kids in the school down there, and also the local community, because if you are about to launch a rocket from Whalers Way, well, there's going to be some place where that rocket needs to be assembled, where the payload, which is a satellite with a bunch of sensors on board, needs to be strapped into the actual rocket itself. Our plan, and hopefully not even too longer term, is that we are actually starting to manufacture those rockets here. Everything from the motors to the shells to the composites that are required to actually create the rocket shell itself. Build the satellite, and as I said, Matty Tetlow down on Lot 14 on North Terrace is literally doing the testing of the gyro stabilizers for his rocket for his satellite payloads on a bench down in the old hospital site down there. So it is not the art of the impossible to actually be directly involved in everything from that manufacture right down to the data analytics and the piece down the road. So support from community in the space sector specifically, it seems to naturally occur because there is this enthusiasm and desire to be involved in it. And as I said, I'm not saying that everybody is pro-space, and you can find as many debates on your Twitter feed at the moment about why spend all that money, Jeff Bezos going into space, why couldn't we solve world hunger? I'm a strong believer that the path to solving world hunger is at least partially done by driving technology investing in the space sector drives technology, which then will hopefully, that side benefit is that we can do things like solve world hunger. So it's a fairly glib statement, but I genuinely believe that we, by us in South Australia being invested in the future of space, is going to drive innovation and development and into advanced manufacturing a lot more quickly than we would get there by osmosis. So I'm a huge fan, and there are so many side benefits, and the community, to your question, is already engaged and will continue to be engaged. And we get as many inquiries, and we've been out to Defence and to DST and given presentations out there, and there are as many skilled people obviously in the space sector out there, but there is still this enthusiasm to be part of that space community, and that flows into our veterans community.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Reg. And thank you for talking both about sort of geographic community as well as the veteran community, which is the purpose of these community conversations. Darren, recognising you're so intimately involved in this, I just wanted to ask you a final question, and that is, look, there's lots of interest and lots of opportunity that we've discussed about the emerging sovereign capability of space, and particularly here in the heart of South Australia. Where can people find more information? And we'll make sure that there's some links on our YouTube channel. But yeah, could you maybe give us the top three of, if people want to stay engaged or learn more, where should they go?
Yeah, there is a lot of information out there, but I'm going to make a plug for the SASIC website, not because it's what we use, but honestly, we post a lot of material up there about what's happening in industry, local industry, and across the board around Australia and internationally. So the South Australian Space Industry Centre has a website. It also has a LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter feed. And on that website, we have things like events, news and media, scholarships and grants that we put out every year, projects and student resources. And just as an example, one of those events coming up on the 15th of September is the Space Forum, the Andy Thomas Space Forum. It's a national forum. It's been growing over the last 7 years, and the last one we had over 1,300 registrations, 700 I think in attendance. So it's really turning out to be a phenomenally important event to get to, or to dial in online and see what's happening in South Australia's and Australia's space ecosystem. The Australian Space Agency also has a good website and a Twitter feed that feeds out information. And then I just recommend looking at some of the strategies. If you're looking at it from a business perspective or a growth perspective, have a look at the South Australian space sector's growth strategy, but also look at Queensland, for example. They've got a reasonable one, and New South Wales as well, talking about where they want to go. Because there's a lot of activity out there, especially in that new space market. New capabilities are being added every day.
Great. Thanks for that. Darren. And gentlemen, we're at that time. Final 30 seconds for each of you to offer any final thoughts, any other messages. Reg?
No, look, Catherine, it's been really, it's great to be part of this. And as you can tell, we're passionate about what opportunities space offers to the community, which includes our veterans community. So I am genuinely excited about where we're going. I really would I'm impatient. I would like things to happen faster, but it's already happening. You can already feel it. Adelaide is transforming across a whole bunch of sectors, and space is going to be one of those ones that really drives the change in mindset, which is changing the whole feeling in Adelaide and the confidence. And we're starting to get people coming back from overseas. It is genuinely an exciting time to be involved in space.
Wonderful. Thanks, Reg. And Darren, can you bring us home?
Bring it home. Okay. Well, it's similar to Reg. We do have an opportunity here to crack this market. It is a global market, but there are emerging areas that we can actually make a wedge into and actually deliver capability for the decades to come. And so we need to stop thinking that this is something that only the large powers and the incumbents can do, and get on board the fact that a change has occurred. There is disruption. Disruption is afoot. New markets are emerging, and we can innovate our way into this new market and actually create capability for our kids that will lead into jobs in the future, and also have spin-offs for Australia in general in areas that we haven't typically had in the past.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both to Reg Carruthers and to Darren Lovett for being part of our panel today around sovereign space capability in Australia. We'll make sure that for our audience that we will include some of those links and websites that you've both talked about during the last hour, and also just to reaffirm what you mentioned, Darren, about the Space Forum that's on the 15th of September. We'll make sure that for those who are interested in knowing more, that they can follow those links. So on behalf of everybody who's been watching us today, thank you, Darren, and thank you, Reg, for your participation and sharing so much information for our community.
Been a real pleasure,
Thanks,
Catherine. Real fun.
Thank you, gents. And now our next community conversation is on the 31st of August. It is always on the last Tuesday of every month, and there are 5 Tuesdays in August. So we look forward to bringing this back to you both face-to-face as well as our usual live stream option. Please follow our Facebook and also subscribe to our e-news if you want to know more. And we will be promoting our next community conversations through those 2 channels. So thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next month.